Roderick Caldwell was known throughout the towering skyline of Manhattan as a man who never broke his word. He was the CEO of Caldwell Capital, a formidable private equity firm that had, under his relentless leadership, grown from a quiet family business into a global powerhouse. Media outlets praised his genius for finding hidden potential in failing corporations, turning them around with a cold precision that bordered on ruthless. His boardroom presence was legendary. Even seasoned investors admitted that Roderick's calm, measured voice could sway entire markets. Yet behind his well-tailored suits and the polished marble halls he reigned over, there was a single vow that no one dared question: he had promised never to love. It was an oath he repeated to anyone who seemed too interested in prying past his polite smile, a confession born of bitter experience he kept locked away in the darkest corners of his memories. When Roderick inherited Caldwell Capital, fresh out of his late 20s, he arrived cloaked in ambition but stained by the memory of a broken home. He'd witnessed firsthand how love could morph into rage and betrayal. His parents, once the embodiment of high society glamour, had descended into a savage divorce that tarnished the Caldwell name in endless tabloids. He, still barely an adult, had been pulled into the crossfire of settlement wars and inheritance disputes. In the aftermath, he constructed a fortress around his heart, swearing he would never let such chaos take root in his life. Where others found solace in romance, Roderick found only a dangerous weakness, one that he believed could unravel empires and ruin men. Over the following years, he tested his vow through fleeting affairs, always ending them before attachment could form. He allowed no one close enough to challenge the iron promise that anchored his life. At Caldwell Tower, his sleek headquarters perched at the city's pinnacle, employees whispered rumors of his aloof nature, while corporate partners applauded his unflinching decisiveness. Some envied his discipline, wishing they too could banish messy feelings from their professional spheres. Others pitied him silently, wondering if, despite his vast success, there might be a yawning loneliness behind those guarded eyes. Roderick paid no heed. His vow had become part of his identity, woven into every business deal and personal relationship he held at arm's length. Yet fate, it seemed, had little regard for carefully crafted defenses. And as months turned into a year at the helm, a single quiet presence within his empire started to erode the foundation of that vow. Looking back, Roderick would pinpoint the day he met her, Avellini Sterling, as the moment the first hairline fracture appeared in the steel fortress of his heart. But at the time, consumed by profits and poised to guide Caldwell Capital to unprecedented heights, he remained blissfully unaware that destiny was already at work, chipping away at the promise he believed unbreakable. In the months following his assumption of full leadership, Roderick Caldwell pushed Caldwell Capital toward a new era of expansion. He brokered daring mergers, reshaped entire departments, and initiated ambitious partnerships that left even veteran board members breathless. In the midst of this whirlwind, the firm acquired an innovative research and design subsidiary, a company on the cusp of creating cutting-edge ecological infrastructures. It was, by every measure, a calculated risk, one that Roderick nonetheless pursued with his trademark confidence. Publicly, he hailed the acquisition as a bold step into the future. Privately, he saw it as another opportunity to exert his strategic brilliance, to prove that he could transform any entity into a profit-making gem. It was during the integration of this new subsidiary that he first encountered Avellini Sterling. Quietly brilliant yet unassuming, Avellini managed project coordination like a maestro conducting a symphony, weaving disparate threads of innovation, finance, and engineering into a cohesive plan. Her official title, Project Development Manager, belied the scope of her responsibility. She was the linchpin holding together a constellation of creative minds, all while navigating the treacherous waters of corporate budgeting. To Roderick, long accustomed to seasoned executives who cowered under the weight of his scrutiny, she presented a curious anomaly. She neither fawned over his achievements nor shrank from his questions. Instead, she met his direct gaze with poised clarity, answering his challenging inquests about timetables and cost structures without flinching. Their first true encounter took place in a sleek conference room on the 50th floor of Caldwell Tower. Roderick arrived late, an unusual lapse that had staff whispering about his jam-packed schedule. Avellini was already there, poring over a digital presentation of projected environmental impacts. When he entered, the subtle tension in the air had the entire team glancing nervously between them. He took a seat at the head of the table with a graceful movement, glancing over the presentation's title, Sustainable Urban Development Initiative. She explained the concept with clear, methodical precision, occasionally pausing to let him interject with pointed queries about ROI or regulatory hurdles. He, expecting another bright-eyed dreamer spouting idealistic nonsense, found her arguments surprisingly robust. No, she wasn't some naive environmentalist ignoring cold, hard numbers. She'd done the math, and she made a compelling case that building sustainable infrastructure could lead to long-term profitability and brand prestige. For someone who viewed philanthropic gestures as marketing ploys at best, Roderick found himself grudgingly impressed. The rest of the team appeared relieved, as though grateful a confrontation had been averted. But Roderick sensed the friction still simmered beneath the surface. Every time Avellini's steely gaze locked on him, he felt a subtle spark, a dare that whispered, "I'm not afraid of you." In the days that followed, he found reasons to request additional information from her. A fresh feasibility study here, an updated financial projection there. She complied with unwavering courtesy, yet never indulged in the typical subservience he often encountered. One evening, after a lengthy session scrutinizing the new unit's budget, they lingered alone in the vast meeting space. Outside, dusk painted the Manhattan skyline in a haze of gold. The building's lights illuminated the glass panels, casting muted reflections on polished floors. He couldn't resist asking her about the driving force behind her fervor for eco-friendly engineering. She replied with surprising candor, a childhood spent near polluted rivers, watching entire neighborhoods succumb to health crises that might have been preventable with better infrastructure. She believed that commerce and conscience could work in tandem, a stance that made Roderick lift an eyebrow skeptically. Still, he found her passion disconcertingly compelling. This time, he didn't respond with his usual stoic detachment. Instead, he listened. Days turned into weeks, and the synergy between them, intellectually, at least, proved beneficial for Caldwell Capital. Roderick recognized that Avellini's innovative approach to risk management complemented his more aggressive style. Slowly, the sustainability initiative drew interest from global partners, who were intrigued by the prospect that Caldwell Capital might pivot into socially responsible investments. But with success came heightened scrutiny. Some board members questioned why Roderick was devoting such attention to a newly integrated subsidiary. Others, used to his unwavering routine, whispered about the subtle changes in his demeanor. He brushed off such speculation, attributing any shifts to corporate strategy, yet privately, he wrestled with an unsettling awareness of how closely her presence tugged on the oath he'd sworn. The vow, that promise not to allow love in, hung like a silent sentinel over every decision he made, particularly those involving Avellini. If he found himself lingering after a meeting to chat, or straying from purely professional conversation, he'd pull back, reminding himself that entanglement was a path to ruin. He recalled the cataclysmic fights he'd witnessed as a young man, the stinging memory of how his parents' union had curdled into open warfare. He would not tread that path, no matter how bright or capable the woman before him seemed. Despite his caution, the tension continued to build. Avellini, for her part, refused to be intimidated. The more the project advanced, the more frequently she clashed with him over corporate priorities. She argued passionately for investing in certain green initiatives that offered modest short-term gains but promised exponential returns within a decade, if the planet's climate crisis didn't overshadow them first. He pressed her relentlessly for metrics, for ROI analyses, for bulletproof justifications that would convince the unyielding board. Their spats often ended with them locked in a duel of gazes, the silent friction sizzling before one or the other pivoted with a forced laugh or a pointed remark. They maintained a veneer of civility, but no one who saw them together could deny the electric push and pull animating their every interaction. Then came the night of an opulent charity gala, hosted by Caldwell Capital in partnership with a renowned philanthropic group. Avellini wore a simple yet elegant gown in deep emerald, her understated style contrasting with the decadent attire of the city's social elite. Roderick arrived in a tailored suit, impeccable as ever, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something unguarded the moment he saw her amid the swirl of cocktail dresses and tuxedos. Their polite greetings crackled with underlying tension. His vow thundered in the back of his mind, urging him to remain distant. Her calm smile hinted that she sensed something stirring, but she masked it behind professional courtesy. Even so, fate insisted on pushing them together. An unexpected glitch in the event schedule forced them to collaborate on a last-minute logistics fix, locking them in hurried discussions near the courtroom while cheerful music and tinkling laughter filled the grand ballroom. They solved the problem efficiently, but the charged solitude left them both breathless, acutely aware of the closeness between them. Aurora tried to steady her breath, surreptitiously glancing at Roderick's face. She caught a momentary flash of emotion she couldn't quite identify, regret, longing, or both. In that tense minute, she sensed that the vow was beginning to buckle, no matter how stubbornly he guarded it. He parted ways immediately after, returning to the crowd, but the knowledge that something was shifting had taken root. Avellini recognized a certain fragile look in his eyes, as though he saw in her something that chipped away at the fortress around his heart. Perhaps it was her unwavering sense of purpose, or her gentle resilience that contradicted his assumption that love led only to chaos. She couldn't precisely name it, but when the night ended, she left with her heart pounding and an unspoken question echoing in her mind: how much longer before we cross a boundary we can never uncross? The next morning, Roderick drowned himself in back-to-back meetings, refusing to dwell on the strange hush that lingered between him and Avellini the night before. He told himself he would handle it the way he always did, by ignoring personal entanglements until they fizzled into insignificance. But as the hours rolled on, and she remained a living presence in his day, commenting in a department briefing, emailing him about a supply chain revision, he felt a growing, uneasy tension in his chest. With every cordial message she sent, every polite nod in the hallway, the vow he'd once pronounced so confidently trembled like a foundation threatened by a quake. By the time another month passed, Caldwell Capital's board applauded the steady progress of the new sustainability initiatives. Roderick, for the public, maintained the role of a triumphant CEO. He gave interviews praising forward-thinking strategies and posed for glossy magazine spreads highlighting Caldwell Capital's philanthropic angle. Yet behind the scenes, his year-long balance of polite detachment with Avellini was nearing a tipping point. He sensed that a single, unguarded night might be all it took to break everything: his vow, his carefully orchestrated life, and quite possibly, her trust. Unbeknownst to him, that night was rapidly approaching, bearing a shocking twist that would irrevocably rewrite the lines he had so meticulously drawn. The board meeting ended in a flurry of polite applause and murmured congratulations, though Roderick Caldwell left the conference room feeling curiously hollow. Yes, Caldwell Capital's quarterly numbers had once again surpassed projections, and the shareholders appeared well pleased. Even the stern-faced directors, who usually peppered him with unending demands, had lapsed into grudging admiration. By all accounts, he had achieved another resounding success. Yet as he strode through the halls of his high-rise headquarters, flanked by sprawling windows that showcased a panoramic view of the city, his thoughts kept drifting to the tension that simmered between him and Avellini Sterling. He recalled catching sight of her at the edge of the meeting, quietly reviewing sustainability updates she planned to present. She'd greeted him with a small nod, her dark hair swept into a neat bun, those unwavering eyes challenging him to acknowledge the silent friction that underpinned their professional interactions. He had offered her a curt, polite smile, as he always did, masking the unsettling awareness that her presence triggered. When the meeting concluded, she departed without a word, leaving him strangely unsettled by the absence of her direct gaze. Later that afternoon, he retreated to his office, a spacious, minimalist domain that radiated the authority he wielded. The floor-to-ceiling windows let in a muted gray light, courtesy of gathering storm clouds above the city. He stood at his desk, scanning messages on his phone. One subject line caught his eye: progress on EcoCities initiative, urgent. His heart quickened. That was Avellini's project, the same one their acquisition had brought on board. Clicking it open, he skimmed the contents: an invite for a final review session with major stakeholders, scheduled at a remote conference facility in upstate New York. The date loomed just a week away, evidently set by some external partner in a rushed attempt to keep the momentum going. His finger hovered over the reply button. A small note from Avellini read: "Given the tight schedule, I'll prepare the necessary data, but I'd appreciate your input." Her tone, though polite, bore her trademark directness. He tried to ignore the churn in his gut. Clearly, they'd have to travel together, stay at the same facility, an arrangement that threatened to crack the precarious distance he maintained between them. But skipping out was not an option. These negotiations were crucial for leveraging the new sustainability angle he had championed to the board. He sank into the leather desk chair, exhaling. His vow against love had never felt more under siege. He recalled his parents' savage arguments, thrown dinner plates, vicious barbs spat in front of staff, culminating in a divorce that lasted for years in court. He'd grown up believing such emotional ties only led to ruin. Every so-called romance he'd entertained was systematically ended before it could root. Now, for the first time, he found himself uncertain. Could he keep that vow intact? And every conversation with Avellini seemed to spark an emotion he'd spent a lifetime evading. Resolute, he typed out a terse acceptance: "Avellini, I'll attend the upstate session. Let's ensure we have all relevant data. RC." Clicking send felt like sealing a contract he wasn't fully prepared to honor. Straightening his tie, he rose to gather the day's notes, telling himself he'd handle the trip exactly as he did every other corporate function: clinically, efficiently, and with an unflinching eye for the bottom line. He refused to let personal entanglements mar a vital negotiation. The following days unfurled in a blur of preparation. The entire firm buzzed about the upcoming retreat. Rumors floated that the upstate facility, nestled amid mountains and forests, provided a tranquil escape from the city's frenetic pace. Some employees joked it was a couples spa disguised as a conference center, referencing the scenic hot springs and lush hiking trails offered on the grounds. Roderick dismissed the chatter with a cutting glance whenever staffers whispered about possible romantic escapades. He reminded himself that he, at least, was immune to such nonsense. Avellini, for her part, showed no sign of uncertainty. She worked tirelessly on presentations showcasing the EcoCities initiative's potential. Whenever she and Roderick crossed paths, usually in the glass-walled meeting rooms or the minimalist cafe on Caldwell Tower's 50th floor, she addressed him with polite conciseness. Yet her eyes seemed to linger, probing for an admission he refused to grant. The few times they spoke outside official matters, she brought up intangible questions about the future of corporate responsibility, as though daring him to reveal a crack in his cold logic. He responded with an aloof confidence that neither satisfied her nor fully convinced him. The tension remained a quiet undercurrent, gathering momentum as the day of departure drew near. At last, the morning arrived when they boarded a sleek black SUV to head north, accompanied by 3 other key staff members responsible for marketing, finance, and PR. The journey began in awkward small talk, speculations about the scenic route, the quality of the lodge's dining, the chance of rainfall. Roderick sat in the front seat, eyes on passing landscapes, while Avellini found a corner in the back, laptop balanced on her knees. She periodically tapped away at a spreadsheet, occasionally glancing up to meet his reflection in the rearview mirror. Each time, he held her gaze for a second longer than necessary before looking away, as though acknowledging a secret they both kept. After a tense 2-hour ride, they arrived at the sprawling lodge nestled by a glassy lake, ringed by rugged mountains. The crisp air smelled of pine and damp earth. A smattering of other guests milled about, employees from the partner organizations, bankers who had sponsored the retreat, and a sprinkling of local officials invited for the final talks. Roderick disembarked, issuing quick instructions to staff about check-ins and a subsequent briefing. Avellini busied herself distributing name badges and collecting itineraries, all while maintaining that veneer of calm competence. By nightfall, introductions and preliminary sessions concluded, culminating in a communal dinner inside a grand hall dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows. The crowd drifted to small tables, lively chatter echoing beneath rustic beams. Roderick accepted a seat next to Avellini, ironically forced upon them by the seating chart. Over the course of the meal, they found themselves engaging in unexpected synergy. He fended off the more mercenary queries about ROI with calm authority, while she deftly illustrated how the Eco-Cities plan served not just profits but the long-term viability of local communities. Observers saw only a dynamic CEO and his brilliant manager collaborating seamlessly. Yet beneath the polished exteriors, they both felt an undercurrent that was anything but professional. Once dinner finished, people dispersed to explore the lodge's amenities or retire early. Roderick and Avellini lingered, stepping into a terrace overlooking the moonlit lake. The hush of night accentuated the gentle lapping of water, the rustle of leaves in a faint breeze. It felt eerily like the rooftop of the Caldwell Gala months earlier, only now the tension was sharpened by the knowledge that in this secluded retreat, the vow might not hold up much longer. She leaned against the wooden railing, taking in the moon's reflection on the dark water. He joined her, hands in his pockets, tie slightly loosened. For a minute they said nothing, just breathed in the crisp air. Then, summoning a courage she hadn't known she possessed, Avellini asked quietly, "Did you ever regret telling everyone you'd never love? That vow you made, did it ever feel like a burden?" His jaw clenched. Moonlight cast stark shadows on his angular face. "It's not a burden," he replied, each word measured. "It's a shield. One that keeps me from the chaos love can bring." She was silent, her own heart pounding with unvoiced defiance. Eventually, he sighed. "But lately, I've questioned if it's worth it, the isolation, he trailed off, swallowing hard. "I'm not sure." Slowly, she turned to him, the soft silver of the moon revealing the trace of sadness and yearning in her expression. "You're allowed to question it, Roderick," she said, voice trembling with empathy. "You're allowed to change." He exhaled shakily, shoulders rigid from the tension that had lodged there. A gust of wind rustled her hair, carrying the faint pine scent from the forest behind the lodge. The hush enveloping them felt like a prelude to an explosion. For an instant, a swirl of old pain and fresh need flashed in his eyes. She saw the conflict and yearned to reach out. Yet he was Roderick Caldwell, a man who prided himself on unwavering discipline. Instead, he stepped back, reasserting a tenuous distance. "We should get some rest," he murmured, forcing a small, distant smile. "Tomorrow's negotiations will be pivotal. Let's be at our best." She nodded, disappointment and relief mingling in her chest. With a final exchange of glances, they parted ways, each carrying the unspoken weight of a bond intensifying by the hour. That night, in her cozy lodge room, Avellini found it impossible to sleep. The warm glow of the fireplace did little to ease her restless thoughts. She replayed the day's interactions, the synergy at dinner, the raw moment by the moonlit terrace, his halting confession that he questioned his vow. Something big and unsettling was shifting within him, and in the private recesses of her heart, she welcomed it, though fear prickled at the edges. Like him, she too recognized that crossing the threshold from tension to intimacy carried risks. Possibly heartbreak, possibly scandal if the staff discovered an affair. Yet there, in the flickering shadows of her room, she admitted to herself that she wanted to see where this path led, vow or no vow. Dawn found her perched on a windowsill, watching the sun creep over mist-wreathed mountains. Soon, they would face the second day of negotiations, the real reason for this retreat. The bankers, local officials, and Caldwell Capital's representatives would gather to finalize or discard the Eco-Cities partnership. A crucial moment for the company, and for Roderick's leadership. She told herself that she needed to focus on the project, to keep personal entanglements at bay. But even as she steeled herself to face the upcoming talks, the memory of his near confessions and the quiet moonlit exchange lingered in her mind. Something unstoppable had begun, an unraveling of old convictions that threatened to rewrite both their stories in ways neither had dared imagine. The second day of negotiations at the upstate lodge dawned beneath a blue sky that belied the tension rippling through every participant. The scent of damp pine and the quiet chatter of delegates drifting through the lodge's rustic corridors stood in stark contrast to the high stakes that awaited in the main conference room. Avellini Sterling arrived early, compelled by both her meticulous nature and the unresolved tension of her late-night exchange with Roderick Caldwell. She'd slept fitfully, her mind caught in a loop of his half-confessions and the simmering attraction threatening to unravel them both. Now, armed with an organized presentation folder and guarded resolve, she settled into a seat at the round table. When Roderick stepped into the conference room moments later, a subtle hush spread over the gathered bankers, local officials, and Caldwell Capital representatives. He wore a tailored navy suit that accentuated his commanding presence, yet a faint shadow under his eyes hinted at a sleepless night. He caught Avellini's gaze for a second, an unspoken question passing between them, before turning to greet the room. His usual polished tone was intact as he welcomed everyone, but she sensed an undercurrent of edginess, a sign that his internal walls were rattling after their conversation the night before. The agenda of the day revolved around the EcoCities initiative, a groundbreaking plan to integrate cutting-edge sustainability into a slate of new developments across the region. Avellini had spent countless hours refining its framework to prove that ecological responsibility and profitability were not mutually exclusive. Early in the discussion, she laid out a cost-benefit analysis, pivoting seamlessly between environmental impact data and investor return forecasts. Applause rippled from a few of the local officials, while bankers scrawled notes and exchanged murmurs. Roderick, seated at the head, offered occasional nods of approval but kept largely silent, as though saving his words for a decisive moment. Midway through the meeting, tensions flared. A high-profile investor, Mr. Leland, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, expressed skepticism about the viability of large-scale green infrastructure. "Let's be frank," he announced with a dismissive wave, "public interest is fickle. ROI might stagnate if consumer tastes shift, or if political support crumbles. Why should we trust Caldwell Capital's leap of faith?" His gaze flickered meaningfully to Roderick, implying that the CEO's personal unpredictability might fuel doubts. Roderick's spine straightened. This was his cue. The vow he had lived by for years whispered caution, warning him that revealing too much passion could undermine his carefully cultivated image. Yet his anger at Leland's derision won out. Rising to his feet, he delivered a pointed rebuttal, underscoring Caldwell Capital's strong track record, the synergy between moral responsibility and long-term financial stability, and the reservoir of trust built through their previous profitable ventures. It was a precise, formidable display of leadership, and under normal circumstances, it might have sufficed. But as the debate raged on, Avellini interjected with equally firm convictions, citing pilot projects abroad that had yielded surprising successes in green infrastructure, bridging the gap between cost concerns and environmental imperatives. Her words, steady yet impassioned, spurred Leland to probe further, lobbing snide remarks that implied Caldwell Capital was diverging from Roderick's historically pragmatic methods. Avellini bristled, prepared to retort, only for Roderick to cut in, voice ringing with cold resolve, "My methods haven't changed. They've evolved, Mr. Leland. We're not discarding profit, we're embracing growth that outlasts short-sighted cynicism." The authority in his tone quieted the room. Avellini observed him closely, struck by how he anchored the argument with a control that teetered on the brink of personal ferocity. Beneath the veneer of corporate suavity, his protective stance reminded her of their conversation on the terrace, the vulnerabilities he'd concealed for so long. She could tell he was dangerously close to letting his emotions override his usual calculated approach. Despite her own heart beating fiercely, she nodded in supportive agreement when Roderick passed her the floor again, as if silently saying, "Your turn, show them how we do this together." The remainder of the session proved grueling. Question after question tested the eco-city's initiative's feasibility. Bankers challenged overhead expenses, local politicians questioned zoning allowances, certain Caldwell Capital board members weighed in via teleconference with queries on brand risks. Yet Roderick and Avellini, unexpectedly aligned, fielded every doubt in tandem, his steely logic reinforcing her idealistic clarity, her compassion smoothing out his blunt retorts. By late afternoon, an uneasy compromise formed. The final documents would be drafted next month, provided Caldwell Capital delivered more robust pilot data. The group broke in tense reluctance. Leland, scowling, shook Roderick's hand but offered a warning glare that suggested further resistance loomed. As the participants dispersed, a few staffers lingered to handle leftover paperwork. Roderick stood at a window in the corner, staring at distant pine trees swaying under a gathering wind. Avellini approached him, heart still pounding from the marathon negotiations. "We won a temporary reprieve," she said softly. "But there's a lot left to prove." He nodded, turning to her with a slow exhale. The afternoon light, dimmed by thick clouds, cast a muted glow on his features, accentuating the weariness etched in his eyes. "I'm used to challenges," he replied. "What I'm not used to is, caring so much about one project, or about," he broke off, gaze briefly skittering from her. "That vow, you know, the one I told you about, I never break my promises, Avellini." She felt a pang of sympathy and a hint of fear. "It's just a vow. People change," she ventured, keeping her voice gentle but unwavering. "You can't carry the weight of your parents' mistakes forever." He gave a wry chuckle, though no humor reached his eyes. "Easier said than done." He paused, as if mustering courage. "Still, it feels like something's different now. Like I can't hide behind that vow anymore, no matter how tightly I cling to it." The room emptied around them, staff drifting out with the day's tension, leaving only the low hum of air conditioning and the rustle of papers. Outside, a storm threatened, thunderheads gathering like a mirror for the tempest swirling in Roderick's chest. Avellini found herself wanting to close the distance, to cradle him in the empathy she felt. Yet a cautionary voice in her mind reminded her of the precarious nature of mixing business with personal longing. She tried to steel herself, to remain rational. "I won't push," she said softly, stepping a fraction closer. She could see the conflict roiling in his eyes, the vow warring against an emerging vulnerability. "I'm not your enemy. We can keep this professional if that's what you need." Yet even as she offered him this escape, her own heart rebelled. That final night of negotiations might be behind them, but it had changed the dynamic irreversibly. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breathing. "That's the problem," he murmured. "I don't want it to just be professional. And yet, I can't risk losing control." Thunder rumbled outside, punctuating his confession with nature's distant roar. Standing there, backlit by the gloom of an oncoming storm, Roderick Caldwell, billionaire CEO, keeper of an unbreakable vow, looked uncharacteristically vulnerable. Avellini recalled the night she'd seen him close to fainting, how she'd helped him regain composure. The same force that had driven her to protect him then now propelled her forward another step, until she stood mere inches away. His posture stiffened, hands half raised as though uncertain whether to embrace or retreat. "I've spent a year telling myself you were just an asset," he admitted, voice catching. "That I admired only your competence. But that's a lie now, isn't it?" A flush warmed Avellini's cheeks, yet she nodded, unable to disguise the truth any longer. "It is. You can't fight everything alone, Roderick. Not even love." Lightning flickered, illuminating the window for a breathless instant. His gaze flicked to her lips, then back to her eyes. Tension practically crackled between them, the vow standing on the edge of a precipice. Another peal of thunder reverberated outside, as though urging him to take that final step. But before either could act on the unspoken desire thrumming in the air, the door burst open, one of his senior aides rushed in, breathless with new developments about the banker's demands. The fragile moment shattered, Avellini stepping back in startled reflex. Roderick's mask of composure slid back into place with startling swiftness. Yes. What is it? He asked curtly, turning to the aide. As the man rattled off fresh complications, an abrupt demand from Leland, an urgent request from a local official, Avellini quietly slipped away, her heart pounding with the knowledge that the line they'd danced around for so long was almost broken. She made her way to an empty corridor, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. The vow was fracturing, sure as the approaching storm that rattled the windows. Tonight might be the night everything changed forever, when that vow either broke for good or shackled them in misery. Whichever path they took, one thing was certain: the fragile barrier they'd kept between them was on the verge of collapse, and the resulting collision might be as shocking as the lightning now streaking across the darkening sky. Aurora skies churned into a swirl of lavender and peach as evening descended on the towering Caldwell Tower in Manhattan. After the stormy confrontation with the bankers and the uneasy revelations that had followed, the company's staff raced to wrap up their day in the wide-open cubicles and glass-walled offices. However, Avellini Sterling found no respite in the hushed twilight. She was still reeling from the tension-laced exchange she'd shared with Roderick Caldwell earlier, the moment when their glances conveyed an unspoken truth, that his vow never to love was hanging by a thread. Roderick had spent the afternoon barricaded in meetings, attempting to salvage the frayed threads of the Eco-Cities Initiative negotiations. Despite successful persuasion on key points, Leland and other suspicious stakeholders refused to give unambiguous support without further assurances. Now, as the day edged into night, exhaustion dulled his normally impeccable focus. Perched at his executive desk, he scanned a final set of reports, mind drifting despite his best efforts. He couldn't banish the memory of Avellini's eyes, the tender concern she wore when challenging his vow. For years, his inviolable promise had served as an emotional fortress. Yet now, every breath reminded him that fortress walls were crumbling. Night overtook the city, leaving Caldwell Tower's upper floors in a subdued glow. Most staff had departed, floor by floor succumbing to the hush of an after-hours lull. Avellini had planned to head home, weighed down by fatigue, but found herself lingering, finalizing a revised pitch deck in a corner of the open-concept workspace. Something restless hummed beneath her skin, an intuition that the night wasn't over. She told herself she simply wanted to ensure no detail was missed, but she suspected otherwise. Part of her waited for a sign that Roderick might want to talk, might allow this precarious tension to break. At last, near 8 o'clock, she saved her presentation, sighed, and slung her laptop bag over her shoulder. In the reflection of the glass walls, she noticed movement in Roderick's office. Warm lamplight illuminated him as he leaned over a document, one hand massaging his temple. She hesitated, torn between preserving her professional distance and confronting the possibility that tonight could be the tipping point. Gathering her courage, she walked to his door, knocking gently. He glanced up, weariness etched into his features. "It's open," he called. She pushed it ajar, stepping into a domain that exuded sleek modernity, dark wood paneling, minimalist art, and a wall of windows framing the sparkling city lights. Roderick looked up from his desk, surprise briefly flashing in his eyes. Then, with forced composure, he straightened his posture. "I thought you'd gone home," he remarked, voice carefully even. Avellini approached, stopping a few paces from his desk. "I nearly did," she admitted. "But I had an updated pitch deck for Eco-Cities to pass along, figured you'd want it before tomorrow's round of calls." It was the truth, though not the entire truth. Part of her had lingered, drawn by the magnetic pull of unfinished business between them. He accepted the manila folder she extended, flipping it open mechanically. His jaw tensed at the numbers, perhaps reading them but not truly seeing them. She waited, shifting on her feet. Outside, the city's glow illuminated the office like a silent audience to their strained quiet. Finally, he snapped the folder shut, exhaling sharply. "This is good," he said, voice tight. "You've done remarkable work. We might still sway those fence-sitters." She nodded, chest fluttering at the subdued praise. A fragile stillness gripped the room. He rose from his seat, stepping around the desk so they stood nearly face to face. "You could have just emailed this," he pointed out softly. "Why did you come in person?" Her heart thumped. The direct question left her mouth dry, but she swallowed and locked eyes with him. "Because after everything, I thought, we might need to talk." Her words held a quiet urgency that matched the swirl of emotion in her chest. "What you said earlier, about your vow," she paused, glancing at the floor. "I just can't keep pretending this tension between us doesn't exist." He let out a trembling sigh, forcibly steadying his shoulders. "You're right," he murmured, stepping closer. The faint scent of his cologne, mingled with the lingering hush of after hours, made her pulse quicken. "I spent my life convinced that I'd never risk love. That vow was my anchor, or my shield. But these months, working with you, I keep feeling that shield crack." She lifted her gaze, meeting his unwaveringly. "So, are you ready to let it break?" The question trembled with both hope and caution. She knew the danger of stepping too close, the possibility of heartbreak, the potential scandal if an affair surfaced within Caldwell Capital, and, more deeply, the specter of his childhood scars. For a long moment, neither spoke. The tension clung thickly in the air, amplified by the faint hum of the building's HVAC system. Then, in a movement as swift as it was deliberate, Roderick bridged the distance between them. His hand lifted, hesitating inches from her cheek, as though granting her a final chance to back away. She made no move to retreat. Slowly, his palm cupped her face, eyes flooded with a longing that belied any veneer of corporate composure. "I'm terrified," he admitted, voice low and raw. "But I'm more terrified of losing something real." Her breath hitched. She could feel her pulse pounding in her throat, an exhilarating blend of dread and desire. The vow he had once declared so vehemently now seemed like a distant echo, overshadowed by the very real emotion blazing between them. Before she could respond, his lips brushed against hers, a tender, questioning kiss that felt like testing the waters of a perilous sea. She answered him with a soft, tremulous fervor, each second unraveling the distance they had maintained for a year. The warmth of his hand on her face, the pressured hush of the deserted office, the faint glow of city lights, everything fused into a moment that crackled with significance. When the kiss deepened, it tasted of unspoken yearnings and repressed confessions. It was both exhilarating and unsettling. She recalled how he'd insisted love was a liability, how she, too, had found romantic entanglements to be precarious. Yet here they were, stumbling across a boundary that might never be mended. The thought ignited a spark of both adrenaline and a sweeter sense of relief. Eventually, they broke apart, foreheads nearly touching. Her cheeks glowed, her breath shallow. "You realize," she whispered, "this changes everything. We can't go back to how it was." He nodded, pressing his lips into a thin line. "I know," he replied, voice hoarse. "But I'm done pretending. And I trust you. More than I trust anyone else." In the faint reflection of the window's glass, they saw themselves entwined, two silhouettes immersed in the gravitational pull of a love they had vehemently denied. Every brush of skin underscored that they were crossing into a realm fraught with complications, gossip, corporate politics, the personal scars Roderick still bore from his parents' meltdown. Yet neither faltered. They stood entwined in that hush, forging an unspoken agreement to defy the vow, no matter the cost. After a moment, she exhaled a shaky laugh, resting her forehead against his shoulder. "I can't believe this is happening," she murmured. "I spent so long convinced you'd never let anyone in." He breathed a smile into her hair, arms circling her waist gently. "I never imagined I would. But you infiltrated my walls, Avellini." They lingered in that fragile intimacy, savoring the stolen moment of calm before reality intruded once more. The ping of Roderick's phone jarred them back into the present. He glanced at the screen, scowling. "It's Leland again." No doubt wanting more concessions, he muttered with resigned exasperation. She leaned back, a slight grin curving her lips. Can't ignore that, can you? He shook his head, releasing her with an apologetic look. We'll talk soon. Properly, he promised, pressing a final, feather-light kiss to her brow before stepping away to answer the persistent call. She nodded, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Neither had fully processed the ramifications of their broken vow, but the sense of relief and heady possibility overshadowed their fear, at least for now. As she slipped out of his office into the near-deserted corridor, the hush of the building seemed different than before. It was no longer steeped in tension but vibrant with the echo of a confession made physical. She walked to the elevator in a daze, the memory of his touch sparking a joyous flutter in her chest. He had broken his vow for her, an act that felt both awe-inspiring and precarious. The future would no doubt test them, the storms of corporate politics, the lingering shadows of his familial trauma, and the cynicism of a world that found romance in the boardroom suspect. Yet for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to dream that their bond might withstand those trials. Returning home, she settled into her quiet apartment, heart brimming with a mixture of triumph and apprehension. She knew the path ahead wasn't guaranteed or free of risk. Nonetheless, as she gazed out her window, the city lights twinkling like a billion possibilities, a tremulous smile took hold. The vow was broken, replaced by something raw and daring, something that might lead them both to heartbreak or to a love as boundless as the skyline they inhabited. And in that fleeting sense of wonder, she found hope enough to carry her into whatever trials the morning might bring. In the days following that charged night at Caldwell Tower, the delicate understanding that Avellini and Roderick had reached became both a source of elation and a magnet for new complications. Whispers, faint but insistent, began to thread through the halls of Caldwell Capital, office gossip about late hours in the CEO's suite, exchanged glances that carried too much warmth, and a sudden shift in how Roderick addressed Avellini during team meetings. Most employees chalked it up to an improving synergy between boss and subordinate, praising the upward momentum of the EcoCities initiative. But a select few, ever vigilant for scandal, cast curious eyes on the pair and whispered of a possible affair in hushed corners of break rooms. Avellini sensed these undercurrents the moment she walked into the office each morning. Stares lingered a second too long, colleagues asked overly casual questions, and some, ironically, treated her with new deference, perhaps speculating she had the CEO's ear in more ways than one. None of it was explicit enough to confront outright, but the tension weighed on her. She had never craved the spotlight, preferring to let her work speak for itself. Now, though, she felt the constant threat that their fragile relationship could be exposed at any moment, potentially unleashing a maelstrom of rumors and corporate backlash. Yet, in the rare, unguarded moments she spent alone with Roderick, these anxieties dimmed. They found solace in stolen glances, hushed after-hours strategy sessions that ended in gentle touches. And with each passing day, his vow to avoid love seemed more distant, as though it had belonged to someone else entirely. However, the high of their newfound closeness soon clashed with escalating pressures from all sides. Leland, the skeptical investor, pressed for conclusive data on the EcoCities initiative, threatening to withdraw a substantial chunk of funding if Caldwell Capital failed to deliver. The board, unsettled by external murmurs of Caldwell's personal entanglements, began demanding more frequent updates on every major project. Even the staff's good-natured chatter turned invasive in pockets. Through it all, Roderick tried to maintain his typical unflappable demeanor, but Avellini observed subtle cracks forming in his stoic facade. Late nights saw him rubbing at his temples more often, pacing his office while scanning urgent emails. She watched him wrestle with the shadows of his father's divorce and his own vow, mindful that stepping fully into love meant ripping open old wounds. One evening, in the hush of an almost deserted floor, Roderick cornered Avellini near a row of floor-to-ceiling windows. City lights sparkled behind him, their reflection merging with the tension in his eyes. His voice dropped low, subdued by the weight of unspoken fears. "Have you sensed the shift around us? The board's growing suspicious of changes in my behavior, especially how I handle the Eco-Cities project. He exhaled, frustration emanating from every tense line of his body. They suspect an emotional angle, which is the last thing I want them to exploit. My father's debacle taught me that once personal matters leak into business affairs, everything can crumble overnight. Avellini placed her hand on his arm, a gentle anchor in the swirl of corporate storms. We can keep it discreet, she offered softly. Focus on the project's success, keep any personal closeness off the official radar until we're ready. We both have too much at stake to let malicious rumors overshadow the progress we've made. She tried to sound confident, though inside she grappled with the fear that secrecy might poison what they were building. Roderick swallowed, nodding. I'm not used to hiding, ironically. I was always an open book about not wanting love. But now, my heart's on the line and I find myself terrified the world will pick it apart. His voice caught slightly, and she saw the flicker of pain that belied the polished CEO exterior. The admission jolted her own worry that the vow he'd broken might still lure him back to the safety of solitude if opposition grew too fierce. Their precarious balance was tested further a few days later when Roderick's paternal cousin, Wesley Caldwell, appeared out of the blue. Wesley was a minor shareholder but possessed a shrewd sense of intrigue, someone who thrived on secrets and leveraged them for personal gain. Under the guise of family interest, he insisted on a private lunch meeting with Roderick, during which he dropped pointed hints about hearing rumors of a developing romance in the executive tier. While Roderick maintained composure, outwardly brushing aside such gossip, the encounter left him shaken. He knew Wesley's penchant for sowing discord, not out of corporate loyalty but for his own manipulative ends. Unsurprisingly, word reached Avellini soon after that Wesley had nosed around the Eco-Cities department, feigning curiosity about the project's finances. Some staff recounted how he inquired about Avellini's working hours, her off-site commitments, even the frequency of her direct interactions with Roderick. It sent a chill through her. Wesley's mild questions reeked of a fact-finding mission, presumably to gather ammunition that could hamper Roderick's leadership or set the stage for blackmail. She confided her concerns to Roderick that evening in his office, the city outside cast in a swirl of pink dusk and glittering headlights. He listened with a stormy frown, tapping his desk impatiently. Wesley's always been a snake, Roderick muttered, anger brimming in the quiet hush. He sees every vulnerability as currency. My vow to avoid love was partly to keep men like him from finding any soft spot to exploit. And now that he paused, clenching his jaw. Now that I've stepped across the line with you, I can't let him weaponize it. The admission stirred something deep in her, an ache for the man who had every reason to remain locked behind walls. She crossed to him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Then let's ensure there's nothing for him to find. We keep our feelings out of the public eye, focus on the Eco-Cities project's success. Once it's a triumph, the board will have no reason to interfere in your personal life. Her words were practical, yet uttering them lodged a pang in her chest. Did it mean continuing in secrecy indefinitely? He rose from his chair, turning to face her, eyes dark with both longing and frustration. We'll do it your way, he relented. For now. He brushed the back of his hand against her cheek, a fleeting gesture that sent a warmth through her body. A flicker of guilt darted across his features. I know you deserve more than sneaking around, but I can't let them destroy us. Not when I've only begun to realize how badly I want this, how badly I want you. Her breath caught. The sincerity in his voice threatened to erode her own caution. Slowly, she cupped his face, letting the tenderness in her eyes convey what words struggled to say. Their lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and charged, a reassurance that the vow he'd shattered was now supplanted by something more potent. Yet the weight of secrecy and corporate peril pressed upon them. They retreated from each other's arms as footsteps sounded in the corridor, the hum of an approaching staff member. Reassuming formal expressions, they parted ways with a silent vow to keep their love hidden from predatory eyes. That evening, Avellini fled the tower with a storm of emotion swirling within her, torn between the joy of newfound closeness and the dread that secrecy might eventually breed resentment or heartbreak. She questioned if Roderick's vow, though officially broken, could still reassert itself under strain. Was she naive to believe that love alone could hold them steady when an entire board, meddling relatives, and a city hungry for scandal circled like wolves? Despite these qualms, she found a fragile sense of hope in the fleeting glimpses of his heart she had uncovered. Love, real love, was no longer just a concept he refused to entertain. He was grappling with it in real time, fighting to reconcile his vow's protective logic with the tangible warmth they shared. If they could weather Wesley's manipulations, if the Eco-City's success could fortify Roderick's position, perhaps they could step out of the shadows. But as the next day dawned with fresh complications, financial uncertainties in the sustainability plan and more persistent inquiries from Wesley, Avellini felt the burden of their hidden bond intensify. She realized with a stirring sense of both determination and fear that the vow's final demise would not come quietly. It would likely take a crisis more fierce than anything they had yet encountered, a showdown that would demand total loyalty, trust, and a willingness to risk everything for the sake of the fragile love they clung to in stolen moments. The tension inside Caldwell Tower had never felt more tangible. From the glossy lobby to the top-floor executive suites, a quiet wariness pervaded every conversation. Ever since the night Roderick and Avellini had admitted, at least in private, to breaking his infamous vow, rumors had crept closer to the truth. Whispers about extra late hours, exchanged glances in the hall, and the subtle shift in Roderick's demeanor all fueled the office grapevine. Avellini did her best to maintain a cool professional stance, but each time she caught a whisper dying on lips as she passed, her heart constricted with the fear of exposure. Meanwhile, Roderick struggled to uphold the delicate balance between his corporate obligations and the secret he guarded with utmost care. He had come to cherish those moments snatched with Avellini, 10-minute coffee breaks in deserted corners, a brisk walk to the parking garage where they could exchange a few words away from prying ears. They communicated as much by subtle gestures as by conversation. A quick squeeze of the hand in an elevator, or a coded remark in a meeting, carried more weight than the lovelorn confessions that might have been possible in a simpler world. On a muggy midweek afternoon, a memo arrived that threw everything into disarray. Wesley Caldwell, Roderick's cunning cousin, who enjoyed stirring trouble, had scheduled an impromptu meeting with several key investors, presumably to revisit the Eco-Cities initiative. The meeting's ambiguous timing and Wesley's known appetite for undermining Roderick's position set off alarm bells. Avellini discovered the memo just after lunch when it landed in her inbox without any official heads-up from Roderick or the CFO. She promptly sought him out. She found him in a small conference room on the 40th floor, bent over some financial dossiers, tension coiling in his shoulders. He looked up at her entrance, that guarded expression softening when he recognized her. Locking the door behind her, she approached, her voice a hushed mixture of anxiety and anger. "Wesley's convening an unscheduled talk with Leland and the local officials tomorrow," she said, tone urgent. "Why isn't the CEO, invited? And why hasn't the rest of the board been informed?" Roderick's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the digital clock on the wall. "I suspect he wants to paint a damning picture of me, that my leadership is compromised by personal distractions, that the Eco-Cities initiative is a vanity project threatening company resources." He inhaled sharply, bracing a hand on the back of a chair. "He'll sow just enough doubt to turn them against me. And if the board starts believing I'm emotionally entangled with a subordinate," his eyes flashed with guilt and protectiveness, "it's the perfect storm." Avellini felt a chill creep up her spine. "We can't let them blindside you. We need to show up. We have to defend the initiative, lay out the facts." She paused, swallowing her own swirling anxieties. "And hopefully keep them from discovering the real reason Wesley thinks you're vulnerable." He gave a quick nod, crossing to her and lowering his voice. "We'll crash the meeting. They can't legally exclude me from official business, even if they try to cloak it as a casual investor lunch. But, Avellini, if push comes to shove, I may have to be ruthless. We can't risk scandal overshadowing the entire project. I need you to be prepared to distance yourself from me publicly if we're cornered. His words pained him visibly, each syllable a reminder that no matter how fervent their mutual affection, they were still dancing in a minefield. A pang shot through her, but she forced composure. I understand. We do what we must to protect the firm, and the Eco-Cities plan. The conversation ended with him slipping out first, giving her a parting look of mingled sorrow and affection. Once again, the promise of love had to bow to the vow of secrecy. The next day came swiftly, carrying with it an electric undercurrent as staff whispered about the hush-hush investor gathering. By mid-morning, Wesley had corralled Leland, a few local officials, and a cluster of curious stakeholders into one of the plush executive lounges on the top floor. Avellini arrived at Roderick's side, each armed with carefully prepared data and the unwavering resolve that if this turned ugly, they'd face it together. They stepped inside to find Wesley perched confidently at a small table, Leland looking smug, and a handful of minor shareholders glancing up with guarded interest. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Wesley offered an oily smile. "Cousin," he said, voice edged with faux warmth. "Didn't expect to see you here. We were just having a casual chat about Caldwell Capital's direction." Roderick took a seat, exuding an exterior calm that belied the fury smoldering in his chest. "Casual? I see. Well, as CEO, any discussion involving the Eco-Cities initiative is my business." He turned to Leland. "If there are concerns, they should be addressed in a transparent manner, not through clandestine gatherings." Avellini eased into a chair beside him, noticing the curious stares as though half the room was analyzing her every gesture. She forced a serene expression, readying her data. Wesley's smug confidence hardened, and he leaned forward with a patronizing tilt of the head. "We're merely seeking clarity. There are rumors, Roderick, about questionable oversight, some kind of personal distraction that's fueling your unwavering devotion to a project that might not pay off. We need to ensure Caldwell Capital remains stable, free from emotional entanglements that could sabotage it." The insinuation landed like a barb. Avellini stiffened but kept her gaze trained on Roderick, silently signaling her willingness to speak up if needed. He, however, steeled his voice, projecting calm authority. "My decisions remain rooted in profit and long-term strategy," he said, each word clipped. "I've merely recognized the potential synergy between sustainability and financial growth. There's no emotional compromise here, only forward-thinking leadership." Leland smirked, crossing his arms. "That's not what I've heard. Certain tongues are wagging about a shift in your priorities. Something about a manager who's capturing more than just your professional interest." He let the implication dangle, a predator savoring the discomfort. Heat flared across Avellini's cheeks, though she clung to composure. The vow Roderick had once proclaimed so loudly stood poised to be tested in public. If he denied any involvement, perhaps he could salvage his image. Yet that denial would slash at the fragile trust blossoming between them. Roderick's fists clenched on the table, knuckles widening. He caught her eye, a flicker of regret passing between them, then pivoted. "You want to talk about emotional compromise?" His tone took on a sharper edge. "Let's discuss results. The Eco-Cities project has garnered promising interest from key markets. We've done consumer polls, presented data, and aligned cost analyses to show stable, albeit slower, ROI. No amount of speculation about my personal life changes those facts." A hush fell. Wesley's smug expression faltered, but he pressed on, voice dripping with condescension. "That might be well and good, but the board prefers a figurehead who's unencumbered. The vow you made so publicly about never letting love or attachments influence you, some of us found it reassuring for the company's direction, ironically. But if you've broken it..." Roderick's eyes darkened, a tumult of anger and defiance brewing behind them. Avellini's heart pounded. He had laid the vow to rest privately, confessing to her that the old rule no longer bound him. But how would he handle the public challenge, the risk of scandal if he admitted love had found him? She prepared to speak, to present the data she had meticulously gathered, hoping to divert the confrontation from personal to professional grounds. Yet, before she could, Roderick drew a measured breath. Caldwell Capital's success was never about that vow, he said, voice steady. It was about disciplined decisions, strategic foresight, and the unwavering commitment of individuals like Ms. Sterling, who bring expertise and passion to the table. He glanced at Avellini, a subtle, private acknowledgement that no vow could overshadow the significance of their bond. If certain people cannot handle the idea that I might be motivated by more than spreadsheets, that's their failing, not mine. My vow was personal, not a firm-wide directive. And yes, I'm acknowledging I'm not the unfeeling machine some believed. Silence descended, thick with shock that he had broached the vow openly. Leland and others gaped, uncertain how to respond. Wesley tried to recover with a scoff, but Roderick's authority kept him off balance. The tension in the lounge crackled. Another word from him, a confirmation that yes, he had broken his vow for a living, breathing manager, and the scandal might erupt. But Roderick tactfully steered the conversation back to the project's numbers, flipping a few pages of Avellini's prepared documents to illustrate specific benchmarks. Avellini followed his lead, diving into technical explanations of budgeting timelines, return cycles, and how EcoCities was poised for a moderate but stable growth path. By the time they finished, the group, albeit unsettled by the vow's mention, had to concede the plan's solid financial underpinnings. Leland, sullen, muttered that he'd hold final judgment, while Wesley's smug facade showed cracks of defeat. The meeting adjourned under a cloud of unresolved curiosity, but with the project still inching forward. Avellini lingered in the lounge as staff dispersed. She found Roderick at the window, gazing at the city's neon sprawl, his shoulders stiff with residual tension. Approaching, she gently touched his arm. "That was intense," she said, voice trembling with relief. He turned to her, eyes weary yet glowing with an odd relief. "I had no choice," he whispered. "They cornered me with that vow, something I never wanted to be a public creed anyway. But I can't let them weaponize it." For a moment, he slid a hand around her waist, drawing her closer in a subtle, protective gesture. She inhaled softly, heart hammering. "I never expected you'd speak so openly about it," she admitted. He exhaled, a shaky half-smile forming. Perhaps the vow was less about never loving and more about never losing control. But controlling everything eventually strangles the life out of it. "This project, it's worth risking a little chaos, don't you think?" She nodded, tears threatening. "It's worth it," she whispered. "Whatever storms come, we'll handle them together." Their gazes locked in shared promise. For the first time, she sensed that even if the vow had once served as his shield, he was now prepared to face any consequences for breaking it. In the hush that followed, his phone buzzed with urgent notifications, the corporate world refusing to grant them more than a fleeting moment. Duty called, but so did the quiet realization that they stood on the brink of a new, vulnerable chapter. Together, they stepped away from the lounge, returning to the reality of Caldwell Capital's swirling demands, yet buoyed by a sense of hope that no vow, however fiercely guarded, could bind a heart that had finally dared to open. Aurora fluttered in the early autumn light above Manhattan, painting the sky in soft pinks and gold, as though nature itself anticipated the watershed day ahead. By the time Avellini Sterling arrived at Caldwell Tower, a subdued hush gripped the lobby. The usual morning bustle was replaced by a tension-laced stillness, employees and executives drifting to their desks, furtive glances exchanged, low-voiced mutterings about how the upcoming board meeting might finalize the fate of both the EcoCities initiative and Roderick Caldwell's fragile hold on the company. Rumors swirled that Wesley Caldwell was making a final push to discredit his cousin, emboldened by a faction of directors concerned over the CEO's new emotional entanglements. Meanwhile, some staff privately whispered about Avellini's rumored role in all of it. She forced a polite smile at those who offered half-hidden curiosity, and made her way to the top floor. Upstairs, tension swelled like a taut string ready to snap. Roderick's executive assistant, typically composed, looked at Avellini with wide, worried eyes and whispered that he'd been in his office since before dawn, poring over data, pacing like a man at war. Taking a breath, Avellini gently knocked on the glossy ebony door and stepped inside. She found him behind his massive desk, leaning over folders and open laptops, his tailored suit jacket cast aside, tie loosened. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed another sleepless night. Yet at the sight of her, his shoulders eased, if only slightly. "You're early," he said, voice husky from overuse or lack of rest. She quietly closed the door. "I wanted to review the final notes for the board before the meeting." Balancing her laptop bag on a nearby chair, she moved closer, each step measured in case any onlooker peered through the glass partitions. "Are you, all right?" she asked in a subdued tone. "This is it, isn't it? If the board sides with Wesley, they could push you out of the CEO seat, or at least tie your hands." She tried to speak calmly, though her heart pounded with the unspoken fear that the vow he'd broken for her might carry too great a cost. Roderick's eyes flickered with a mixture of determination and weariness. "Let them try," he muttered, squaring his jaw. "I have the performance data, I have the employees' general support, and we still hold the biggest shares. Wesley can attempt to sow doubt, but ultimately, the numbers stand in our favor." Then, quieter, he added, "All that aside, the question is whether they'll exploit us. If they do, we have to be prepared." Avellini swallowed. She recalled with piercing clarity how he'd once insisted no love, no romance, no entanglements could ever breach his carefully structured life. Now that they had permitted their affections to blossom, it placed a target on him in a world that thrived on scandal. "We face it together," she said with gentle conviction, her hand daring to hover near his on the desk. There was no one else in the office, only the hush of the high-rise and a tension-laden sunrise. If the vow had to be broken, let it at least be for something real. He let out a breath, threading his fingers through hers for one stolen moment of tenderness. "A year ago, I'd have thrown you out of this office for suggesting I could care this deeply," he murmured, an ironic twist of a smile crossing his lips. "Now I can't imagine losing you. But that doesn't mean it will be easy." She squeezed his hand once, then released it, stepping back to preserve the brittle boundary of professionalism. "So we face the board, lay out EcoCity's success potential, and keep personal matters out of it. If Wesley tries to shame you publicly, we shift focus to the data. Stick to the plan." He nodded, forcing a tight, determined smile. The hours before the board meeting ticked by in a haze of last-minute updates, calls from anxious investors, and staff drifting in with fresh queries about the day's agenda. Soon, the board's special session commenced in the stately meeting room, a place of polished wooden tables, plush chairs, and panoramic windows overlooking Manhattan's labyrinth of steel and glass. The directors filed in, exchanging wary nods. Wesley arrived in a crisp suit, every bit the smug opportunist, while Leland and a few bankers accompanied him with vaguely disapproving faces. Roderick, with Avellini beside him as lead coordinator for EcoCities, greeted them coolly, tension coiled in the set of his jaw. The opening remarks covered standard business, corporate expansions, a recap of last quarter's profit margins, followed by mundane housekeeping issues. But the air crackled with anticipation for the main event. Finally, Wesley cleared his throat and launched into a carefully curated statement, delivering the punchline: "While Caldwell Capital's near-term prospects appear strong, we can't ignore concerns about strategic distractions. Certain shareholders have flagged Mr. Caldwell's personal involvements as potentially compromising to objective decision-making." His gaze swept to Avellini, lingering pointedly, though he refrained from naming her outright. A hush fell. Avellini's pulse drummed in her ears, but she steeled herself to appear composed. Roderick sat rigid, a muscle in his jaw ticking as he absorbed Wesley's insinuation. "If you have allegations about my personal life, let's clarify them, Roderick said coldly, every inch the formidable CEO. But we all know Caldwell Capital's success hasn't wavered. Our growth and partnerships continue to thrive. The EcoCities initiative stands to open new markets. Wesley feigned regret. Success thus far, cousin. But expansions can falter if a company's leadership is compromised. I'm only suggesting we reassess who's best fit to guide us forward. He shot a glance at Leland, who nodded in grave agreement. Unable to remain silent, Avellini spoke up, the EcoCities plan is no vanity project. We have metrics, pilot programs, investor polls. She tapped a digital presentation open on the large screen, launching into a succinct breakdown of cost forecasts and revenue models. Each chart underscored the initiative's viability, painting a compelling picture of future returns. The board listened with measured interest, but an undercurrent of tension persisted. A few directors, evidently influenced by Wesley's rumors, posed unusually probing questions about Roderick's focus. Didn't he, they insinuated, appear distracted? Weren't there whispers of unwise personal entanglements shaping corporate direction? With each question, Roderick remained stoic, deftly deflecting. Avellini backed him with methodical clarity, answering the more technical points. For a moment, it seemed they might ride out the wave of suspicion. Then, in a final gambit, Wesley declared, we cannot let rumors undermine Caldwell Capital's trustworthiness. Roderick's vow to remain unattached was once seen as guaranteeing unswayed leadership. Now, the board might consider whether that vow's breach signals deeper reliability issues. A gasp rippled through some corners of the room. The vow, spoken in a formal setting, felt like an explosive secret laid bare. Avellini's breath hitched. She glimpsed the tremor in Roderick's hand. The vow was front and center now, a symbolic anchor for the unyielding image he'd cultivated. Here, in a public forum, the vow's collapse risked scandal. Yet Roderick clenched his jaw, raising his chin in defiance. Yes, I once swore I wouldn't let love, or personal attachments, compromise me, he said firmly, voice resonating in the hushed room. But I am not less of a leader for acknowledging that vow no longer governs me. The company thrives on adaptability. So do I. It was a rare, raw admission. Murmurs spread among the directors. Wesley pressed his advantage. So, you admit you're personally involved in ways that may sway your decisions? He asked with a sneer. Roderick exhaled, scanning the faces around him. His gaze caught Avellini's, then darted away, heavy with regret that she might be pulled into the crossfire. But rather than deny or fling accusations, Roderick stated calmly, I am the same man who took Caldwell Capital from comfortable stagnation to aggressive expansion. Whether I had a vow or not, my track record stands. And EcoCities is a strategic choice backed by strong data. He gestured to Avellini, who immediately displayed the risk mitigation plan. I challenge anyone here to point to a single instance where my alleged personal compromise has harmed the firm's bottom line. A stony silence gripped the room. Some directors exchanged uncertain glances. Despite the swirl of rumors, no one could refute the numbers, the climbing profits, or the promise of EcoCities. Even Leland sat in grim silence, apparently lacking a direct retort. Wesley grimaced, realizing the momentum was slipping from his grasp. The meeting adjourned without a resolution to remove Roderick, though the board demanded a formal review in a month's time. A fresh wave of tension gripped everyone. Avellini lingered, letting the other staff and directors file out in subdued conversation. At last, only she and Roderick remained in the cavernous, glass-walled meeting room, the city's twilight bathing them in a quiet, reflective hush. He sank into a chair, elbows on the long table, shoulders drooping from fatigue. She approached, standing behind him, gently placing her hands on his broad shoulders. That was intense, she murmured. But you held your ground. He tilted his head, letting out a ragged breath. Thanks to you, he said softly. I almost let the vow overshadow the real issues. You kept it on track. Then, turning in the chair to look up at her, he reached for her hand. I can't promise our next steps are easy, or that the board won't keep circling. But we survived this. And that vow, he paused, shaking his head. It's done. I'm not going back. A warm hush enveloped them. The tension that had threatened to unravel them seemed to dissolve in the moment. Avellini knelt by his chair, her eyes shining with tears she refused to shed. And what if the next crisis brings them back with sharper weapons? Are you ready to stand by us, love, even then? He cupped her cheek with calloused fingers. I've spent my life building walls to keep out the pain of betrayal, but also keeping out everything that makes life worth living. Maybe I won't do it gracefully, but yes, I'll stand by what we've started. His voice thickened with emotion he rarely displayed. She smiled tremulously, leaning forward to press a tender kiss to his lips, ignoring the echo of footsteps far down the corridor. Their vow to keep their love hidden was overshadowed by a new pledge, to face every attack with honesty, forging a future built on trust rather than fear. And even if outside forces continued to swirl around Caldwell Capital and the Eco-Cities initiative, the bond they'd forged, one that overcame a vow never to love, would hold them steady. As they left the silent, imposing meeting room, hand in hand, the hush of the city evening greeted them. In that hush, they felt both the weight of unknown battles to come and the thrill of forging an uncharted path together. Roderick Caldwell, billionaire CEO, breaker of promises, and Avellini Sterling, the quietly fierce project manager, stepped into the elevator, hearts resonating with renewed courage. The vow was well and truly broken, in its place glowed the unsteady, exhilarating flame of genuine love that would spark the next chapter of their intertwined fate.